Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a very special treat for you. I did an interview with the world famous biblical scholar, Dr. Craig Keener. As Gary Habermas calls him, he is a scholar's scholar. He's the scholar that all the scholars go to figure out what the truth is. So it was a great pleasure having Craig back on the show. Now, Craig Keener mentioned to me afterwards that he would like to kind of break it up into parts. So I'm going to fulfill that promise. There are different segments, and I'm going to break them up into multiple segments, maybe between 3 to 5 uh, parts for the show. And once those parts have been posted, then I will release the full 2.5 hour video as one long video as I normally do. But I just wanted to honor Craig Keener's humble request that I kind of break it up into parts for him because he might post this up on his channel for his fans as well. So, yeah, with that said, let's get into it. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I have a very, very special treat, something that I haven't had the pleasure of doing in at least a few years now. Have Dr. Craig Keener on the show. Hey, Craig, how are you?
I'm doing a great deal. How are you doing?
I'm very good, and very pleased to have you on with this show because I think the last time you were on, it was at least 5 years ago, maybe.
Wow.
On We were talking about the historicity of Acts. That's when your massive commentary came out there, and you were kind of engaging with my atheist co-host at that time. So, yeah, it's great to have you back. And
Great to be with you.
Awesome. And yeah, so today we're kind of looking at the historicity of the resurrection. And there's a special reason for that that you'll find out towards the end. But just before we get into today's topic, Craig, just for those who may not have caught the last episode, do you want to just give a brief intro as to who you are? And talk about your scholarship because I had an Eastern Orthodox person once tell me his name's Tyler Fowler, and he was saying that he doesn't find Protestant scholars know how to read the Greek outside of biblical Greek. So he's saying there's a difference, but yeah, what's your? I know you're very well read as a classicist, so yeah,
Yeah, some Protestant scholars just read the Greek New Testament, and sometimes the Septuagint, which is sometimes easier than certain parts of the Greek New Testament. But anyway, um, yeah, I did my PhD in New Testament and Christian origins at Duke University. That was some years after my conversion from atheism, so I wasn't really interested in the New Testament when I was an atheist. And my Acts commentary, I cite probably 45,000 extra biblical ancient references to shed light on the text there. And I've written 37 books, maybe 19,000 pages so far in terms of books, plus a bunch of articles. And anyway, um, that's probably enough of that. But
fair enough, fair enough.
and I'm a professor of biblical studies at Asbury Theological Seminary.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, with that said, I do want to get straight into this topic because it is an essential doctrine. As Paul says, if the resurrection's false, our entire faith's in vain and
Right.
it's out the door, right? We're still in our sins there. Um, but the first thing I want to ask you about is, well, look, this whole thing about the resurrection, uh, there's so many skeptics online that will say, look, this is just a myth. There are these dying and rising gods in the pagan Greco-Roman myths and other ancient Near Eastern myths. So I want to turn it to you. Is this true? Are there cases of a genuine death and resurrection of various pagan gods that are out there?
Some of this, some of this people could argue for just over a century ago. There was James Frazier's Golden Bow, which kind of took disparate myths from all over the world and tried to find common threads to blend them together. And in so doing was often reading one thing into another and really things that were quite different. There was like a little bit of similarity. And so um, So you had this emphasis on mystery cults back in the very early 20th century. And you had some scholars like Bousset, who, Wilhelm Bousset, who, um, in his Curios Christos, just just went crazy with all these parallels, irregardless of whether they were later than the New Testament or earlier than the New Testament. Some of them were influenced by the New Testament, and I think it also has something to do with that era, pre Nazi Holocaust era, where people were shying away from the Jewish sources, which are obviously the most close. I mean, if you're going to talk about Galilee and you're going to talk about Jesus, what's closest that you should look to for background there? Well, what were the ideas that were floating around there? And today archaeology shows that Jewish communities in Galilee, they had mikvaot, which are ritual immersion pools based on Jewish ideology from the previous century or two, in terms of ritual purification. You had stone pots, you had which were impervious to ritual impurity. In other words, these are very Jewish communities. They barely even were trading with Gentiles in this period. Most of their trade in Galilee was with Jerusalem and other Jewish communities. So, the first place you would naturally look, archaeology shows us this. Oh, and back then there were also people who were saying that the Galileans were Gentiles, which fits entirely the wrong period. I mean, after Judean settlement in Galilee, about a century and a half before Jesus' ministry, the population increases something like 5 times over. I mean, the archaeology is clear. This was all Jewish. So these ideas that Jesus was related to these, mystery cults, and how do we know what mystery cults even taught anyway? I mean, some of the vocabulary is not found at all in the New Testament, mystes and things like that, as Sir Arthur Darby Knock pointed out about a century ago in his work as a classicist. But even with that, how much do we know about the mysteries? Well, they were mysteries. You weren't supposed to know much about them. The way we found out about them was that later pagan converts to Christianity who'd been in the mysteries talked about what they saw in the mysteries, and they were talking about it through their grid of Christian understanding, and they spoke of it as a demonic imitation. Well, some of it actually probably was an imitation because the mysteries were very syncretistic. So they would borrow from one another. And as Christianity is spreading in the late 2nd century, they're borrowing from that too. And those are basically most of our sources about what was going on in the mysteries. But having said that, there were stories about gods who came back or people who came back, like Orpheus, who was a person in the myth, Greek myth. He wanted to get his wife Eurydice. I'm trying to pronounce it the Greek way, but we usually see Eurydice or Eurydice, whatever in English, but Eurydice in Greek. He wanted to get her back from the underworld, so he goes down there and he charms everybody with his music and gets her, but he looks back and she slides back into the underworld. Not quite a resurrection there. And then Asclepius is raising people, but these are not like the New Testament Jewish concept of resurrection, which is an eschatological event. It's a transformation. You'll never die again. I mean, anybody raised in the myths, or anybody raised in the Old Testament, or anybody raised in Jesus' ministry, they're raised temporarily. Like if a doctor resuscitates somebody, well, they'll be back hopefully for a while, but sooner or later we all die again. That's different from the Jewish concept of the resurrection. Now, a lot of the things that are supposed to be dying and rising gods. Now you do have Osiris. That is pre-Christian. And there were plenty of worshippers of Osiris in the pagan world, not in Galilee, not in Jerusalem. Uh, and of course the accounts of the resurrection, we know they go back to within days, 1 Corinthians 15 and so on, which I'm sure we'll come back to. But the idea of Osiris is just magically revivified by the natural potencies that are already in nature, and he stays in the netherworld. He's still dependent on the gods, so, but that was the kind of the closest thing. Then you've got stuff like Adonis and so on. They actually, there's no evidence for people saying that they had risen. I think maybe his little finger would move and his body stayed incorrupt, and that's it until well after the Christian message had widely circulated. So basically, Fraser and those who followed him were taking the grid of a resurrection story and imposing it on a whole bunch of other things where there was missing evidence. And it's like, you're expecting to find the missing links, but they never turn up because they're not there. And so anyway, all that to say that, oh, and even Persephone. I mean, Persephone, she goes down to the underworld alive. And then, she's a goddess anyway, so she's not really dying per se, although Ares got wounded in Greek mythology. But the idea of seasonal revivification in the spring. So, things die in winter and then they come back to life in the spring. That's so different. I mean, that's an annual thing. It's so different from the eschatological resurrection that you've got in Daniel and the Old Testament. That's the basis for the New Testament idea of a once for all permanent restoration of an immortal body.
Yeah, yeah. Even Bart Ehrman, right? He says like, look, Jesus is not a fertility god or an
Right.
agricultural god or something like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, it's the disanalogies are just amazing.
And,
So yeah,
some of the scholars, uh, I mean, a century ago, it might have been excusable when we didn't have as much information. But like one of the scholars who does stuff like this, I call him a scholar. He's got a PhD. He's written books, but I
Richard
mean,
Carrier or
and
Richard.
I'm not talking about Richard. I actually haven't seen him do this particular thing, but the one I'm talking about has talks about, in the mysteries, they greeted one another with a kiss. And to be initiated in the mysteries, you would be go through a bodily washing. And so obviously the New Testament must get this from and they would eat together. So the New Testament must get this from the mysteries. The only way somebody could say that was if they were totally ignorant of the rest of the ancient world. Every guild, every religious group, including synagogues, ate together. And is in terms of kissing, people greeted one another with kisses, especially if they were kin or part of the same in-group. They would greet one another with kisses. That wasn't distinctive to mysteries in any way. And in terms of washings, ceremonial washings, that was used for initiation into anything. I mean, sometimes you'd have to do it before you entered a particular temple, and certainly the Jerusalem temple, you'd have to do it. And of course, the mikvaot that we mentioned earlier, the immersion pools that were used by Jewish people in Judea and Galilee. And if Gentile wanted to convert to Judaism, they'd have to be immersed in water, and this, and this is also acknowledged by Epictetus, who's a Gentile philosopher talking about Judaism, and apparently in Juvenal, another Gentile author, and it's in the Sibylline oracles. And anyway, we could just go on, but all that to say, the only way they can say, oh, this must be from the mystery religions, is if they're totally ignorant of the rest of the ancient world.
Yeah, yeah. It's night and day. And I like that you kind of mentioned in your answer, you went into like this concept of resurrection proper. It's thoroughly steeped in Judaism. It's a Jewish belief kind of thing in the ancient world. And I just kind of want to ask you and probe a little bit further into that. So what, starting with the Old Testament, like what exactly is the Jewish background of the concept of resurrection proper leading in to the New Testament? And does that change at all? Because I've heard skeptics say that originally in the oldest parts of the Old Testament, they didn't even have a concept of the afterlife. And then they evolved into a disembodied state. And then eventually by Daniel and the Persian period, they invented this resurrection and copied it from the Persians. So what's your take on the Jewish background from the Old Testament to the New and the development, if any?
Yeah, it's hard to say what they could have gotten from Persians because our Persian sources are all later, as Edwin Yamuchi has shown. Which isn't to say that they couldn't have gotten something from the Persians. It's just to say it's hard to show for sure. But it is true that there is development within the Old Testament because in the early parts, I mean, when they talk about eschatology, it's corporate eschatology. That's what they're dealing with. So collective restoration of God's people being gathered to the land. In terms of afterlife of individuals, the issue doesn't come up. Although one archaeologist did point out that they left like holes in the tops of certain burial things, like which in surrounding culture suggested some idea of an afterlife. But that's I don't want to read too much into that because
Is that
it's
breathing holes or something? Or I don't know.
that's he took it as something like that. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it there because it's
Fair
kind of
enough.
speculative how you interpret that kind of evidence. But it was natural in the Persian period in the exile when they do have to, they're addressed with new questions, and so they come up with answers for those questions. But I do think it probably goes back. Well, some of the thing depends on when you date certain documents. I think it's there in Isaiah 26. I think it's there in Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14. Uh, Maybe they're in Job 19, although that could be from the Persian period. Um, the Isaiah 26 is I think pre-exilic, but um, where it's clearest, and these other things are disputed, but where it's clearest, and I do think you have afterlife things in the Psalms and so on, or things that could go, some things that could go like there's no praise of you in Sheol, but then other ways of looking at it, like I'll be with you afterwards. But Daniel 12 is pretty clear, and it's like kind of a new body thing too. They're compared with stars, and so there's everlasting life versus everlasting shame. Now, even among early rabbis, there were different interpretations, especially regarding the resurrection of the damned idea. But the resurrection of the righteous, the rabbis were unanimous on that. In fact, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1 says that all Israelites will be resurrected and have a part in the world to come, except certain ones, including the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection. They won't get it. But you've got probably implications of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Pharisees certainly affirmed it, is widely documented in ancient sources. And of course, the Pharisees, Josephus tells us, represented the more popular views within Judaism as opposed to the Sadducees. And you've got the Jewish apocalyptic literature that talks about it, and and yeah, you have a number of sources both before and after the New Testament period. But certainly Daniel chapter 12 talks about this. Now it's a corporate, collective, eschatological resurrection. So it's something future, and when that happens, it's settled. It's like permanent. So when Jesus talks about it, some people don't believe that he actually predicted his death, or a la Albert Schweitzer even foreknew his death. But there's no way you're going to overturn tables in the temple and challenge the temple hierarchy, or do something like that anywhere in the ancient world, and not anticipate your death, unless you either raised an army or got out of town really fast, neither of which Jesus did. So, I mean, he didn't just predict his death, he provoked it. I mean, he knew he was going to die. So it makes sense that he would have told his disciples in advance. Now, when they would have heard him talk about the resurrection, though, in 3 days, they would have probably taken the 3 days figuratively, because they're thinking of a collective resurrection. So, okay, either everybody's going to rise in 3 days, or it's going to be a while. So he's going to rise, but they weren't expecting it right away. They weren't expecting something like an empty tomb. And yeah, anyway.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. I think you know what well you kind of hinted at this, but just one sort of follow-up question here is well look, there are accounts prior to Jesus of resuscitations, let's say. Whereas Jesus is seen as the first fruits, the first and only example of this unique resurrection event. That's at least unique until the end of the general resurrection, so to speak. So, do you mind just very quickly, what is the difference between someone like Lazarus who was resuscitated versus Jesus' actual resurrection there?
Well, Lazarus isn't still alive today. Um, yeah, and again, it's the same. We have people resuscitated today, whether you're talking about medically or otherwise, or people misdiagnosed as dead. Sometimes that also happened in the ancient world. You've got a lot of stories from the ancient world about that happening. Many of them very plausible. I mean, you have them in fiction, but you also have them in historical sources, where somebody was thought to be dead, and then they actually usually they were pretty sick and they didn't last very long. They died again right away. But but you know, out of millions of people who died, once in a while you get it wrong, um, or they recover. And of course, the ones with Elijah and Elisha, and then the widow of Nain's son, uh, Luke 7, and Jairus's daughter in Mark 5, and Lazarus in John 11. You have, and then Tabitha or Dorcas in Acts 9, and Eutychus in Acts 20, which actually is from eyewitness material, from the we material in Acts. And then you've got it happening again in history with, like, there was a Mesopotamian bishop later who was converted in the year, I think it was 99, when a Syrian evangelist raised somebody from the dead in front of him. You have all these reports through history. We've got plenty of reports today, some of them medically documented, of people coming back as a result of prayer. Things that wouldn't have happened normally without something dramatic intervening. I could go into this in more detail, but these people all end up dying again. They don't get immortal bodies. They don't, necessarily glow like stars. They can't walk through walls like Jesus,
Yeah,
with a new kind of body, or suddenly disappear,
yeah.
or be unrecognizable or whatever. Paul speaks of that, of we're going to have a glorious body like his own glorious body. And this is undisputed, early letters of Paul. So this is just within, I mean, most of Paul's letters run from between the years 50 to 60, give or take a couple of years, maybe around the edges. And therefore, we're talking about, within the same generation of somebody who's absolutely convinced and takes it for granted that, I mean, even with the Corinthians, where he's got to convince them that they're going to rise from the dead, he's like, don't you understand? Jesus' resurrection is the beginning of that. So you already believe Jesus rose from the dead. Look, you got to accept the implications of that for us. This was widespread, so far as we can tell, unanimous belief among Jesus' followers in the first generation.
Awesome. So I'm glad that you brought up, because I was going to ask the follow-ups here. So, beyond just the immortality of the resurrection bodies, that it will also be a glorious resurrection body. So you think perhaps, maybe we'll have transdimensionality, or we can walk through walls, kind of thing, like Jesus. What about questions of, like, so for example, Jesus, he appeared with the wounds
Mm.
as well, or the age. Do you think that's are we gonna be resurrected as the same age if we die in our 80s? And are we gonna have wounds? So if I get my head blown off, am I gonna be walking around like the headless horseman? What was the Jewish concept of resurrection on that front?
There were actually different ones. Now, a lot of them took their starting point from Daniel, and they spoke of being like stars. Of course, we have a better understanding of stars being just hydrogen and helium, but that wasn't part of the analogy back then.
Yeah.
So for them, it was like uh, bright and heavenlies. And so, Paul speaks of a heavenly body versus an earthly body. He speaks of a spiritual body versus literally a psychikos, you could say soulish body, natural body, our current body, but which is fitted for the life of psyche, like God breathed in Adam breath of life and he became a living psyche. So we've got our current bodies are like Adam, but like the new Adam, the last man from heaven. I'm doing 1 Corinthians 15 here. We will have heavenly bodies. He compares them like with stars and other things in the heavens. So glorious and different in character from our current and moved pneumatikos, spiritual, moved by the Spirit. So the Spirit raised Jesus from the dead. Paul talks about that elsewhere. The same Spirit already at work in us. We have a foretaste of resurrection life already at work in us, but we will have resurrection bodies totally transformed by the Spirit. And you've got Paul talking about this kind of stuff in First Thessalonians, which may be his earliest letter. Some people say second earliest. You've got it in Philippians, which is toward later period. Pretty clearly there, he's going to come back from heaven and we'll get bodies like his. You've got it in 1 Corinthians 15. I see it in 2 Corinthians 5. Some people say, well, that's not talking about the resurrection body because he says we have it already, but we have it in the sense that it already belongs to us, not in the sense that we've already put it on, to use Paul's language, because he says we have the down payment, we have the foretaste of the Spirit. So we have that guarantee already. But the language he uses is so much like 1 Corinthians 15. I think he's talking about the resurrection body there as well. So it's and for Paul, it's like this is, well, just like for churches that recite the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the body. Well, that's, it's pretty fundamental to the Christian faith that we do have a future hope, and it's not just disembodied floating around, but it's not this kind of body. It's a different kind of body.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one thing I was always wondering. Like Paul, he describes the disembodied state as like almost being naked, like there's some kind
Yeah,
of incompleteness
yeah.
there. So, yeah, we're designed to have souls and bodies. So that is part one finished. Looking at what is the resurrection, the Christian concept of the resurrection, and Jesus's resurrection in particular. What is that? How does it compare to other people being raised from the dead before Jesus and that sort of thing? And fundamentally, is the Christian concept of the resurrection steeped in Jewish beliefs or pagan beliefs? The pagan dying and rising gods. So I hope you guys enjoyed the part one here. In part two, we're going to start looking at the evidence that proves in Jesus' resurrection is actually a fact of history. So that's where we're going to start looking at that. So I hope you guys enjoyed part one of Craig Keener on the evidence for the resurrection from the Bible, from a biblical perspective. All right. God bless.